Hi, I'm Neville Hode. I'm an associate professor in the English department, and I co-direct the Rapoport Center with Karen Engel, who unfortunately cannot be here today because she's on sabbatical. So we miss her, but I'm envious. We're very excited for this moment in our Rapoport Center Faculty Affiliate Book Talk series. We're going to be hearing from Professor Jason Cons, who's going to talk about his book, Delta Futures, Time, Territory, and Capture on a Climate Frontier, that is relatively hot off the presses from the University of California Press in 2025. Jason Cons is an associate professor of anthropology here at UT, and he's a member of the Rapoport Center Steering Committee and one of the center's key co-conspirators and interlocutors on our environmental justice work. So it really is an honor and a pleasure to have him with us here today. He works on borders in South Asia, climate and agrarian change, and rural development. He's conducted extensive research in Bangladesh on a range of issues, including climate security, disputed territory along the India-Bangladesh border, the impacts of shrimp agriculture in coastal areas, and the politics of development. And those interests move from his first book into the book we're going to hear about today. His recent research is situated in the Sundarbans and the Southwest Delta region of Bangladesh, addressing climate change development, conservation, industrialization, piracy, and security. It explores the ways that imaginations of the future and future climate change are shaping the Delta and the India-Bangladesh border in the present. So we really get a global perspective on environmental justice and climate change and the impacts of climate change often on highly, highly vulnerable people. The book that we're going to hear about today, as I said earlier, was published by the University of California Press in 2025. It explores the politics of future making in the Bengal Delta in an era of climate change. He doesn't only write books. He's the co-editor of a volume entitled Frontier Assemblages, The Emergence of Politics of Resource Frontiers in Asia, and he's a co-editor of Lim 12 Climates Interiors, which I find a very provocative and quite delightful title. He is part of the Lim Editorial Collective and a former editor of South Asia, the Journal of South Asian Studies. So we're getting to hear from a leading scholar and a field builder in a very pressing area of inquiry right now. His respondent today is Professor Shiv Ganesh, who is a professor of communication in the Department of Communication Studies at Moody College, also here at the University of Texas at Austin. Prof. Ganesh studies communication and collective organizing in the context of globalization and digital technologies. So you could see the overlap, even though we're in cognate but different disciplines. His work spans critical institutional and post-structural approaches to communication, and in the last 2 decades has focused on technological transformations in collective action, activism, dialogue, conflict, sustainability, and transparency. So there's lots of futures in there as well. His research is ethnographic, so there's a little overlap here as well, and largely qualitative, but has incorporated quantitative elements, and he's done fieldwork in a number of countries, including India, Aotearoa, New Zealand, the United States, and Sweden. He has published too many articles and been awarded too many grants to list here. We'd be here for a while, but we could not hope for a better campus respondent to Professor Cons' wonderful new book. So how we're going to do this is Jason Cons will present, Shiv Ganesh will respond, maybe they'll have a bit of back and forth, and then we'll open it up to the audience for Q&A. All right, before I relinquish the podium, please pick up one of these flyers. It's a book reading that we're co-sponsoring at the Rapoport Center with the Joins Reading Room on Thursday, November 6th, and it should be pretty great. So pick up a flyer, tell your friends, and I'm greatly looking forward to this presentation and discussion. Thank you, Jason.
Thanks, Neville, for that lovely introduction, and thanks to everyone at the Rapoport Center, including Karen and Cooper, for helping to make this possible, and thanks to all of you guys for coming and sharing your lunch with me, and especially thanks to Shiv for taking this on. I know that finding time to read a book in the middle of the semester that's not on your syllabus is always a little bit of an adventure. My plan for the next 30 minutes or so is to give you a brief overview of the puzzles that prompted my book, Delta Futures, a book which charts the competing futures at play in visions of climate change in Bangladesh's Delta region, a space which is regularly described as one of the most climate vulnerable places in the world, and the ways that these competing and often dissonant futures are collectively and profoundly shaping the Delta's present. Along the way, I'm going to dip into some of the core ethnographic material that constitutes the book's primary matter, just to give you a sense of what I'm basing my arguments on. Before I begin, it's worth noting that several things have changed in the world since I wrote this book, one of which is the dissolution of the Awami League, the party that was largely the single-party state in Bangladesh for well over a decade, which fell last summer, 2024. And is sort of a subject of some of the book's critique. Another is the act of feeding USAID, which exemplifies some of the development interventions that I talk about in this book, Into the Wood Chipper by Elon Musk and the Trump administration. I'm not going to comment on these changes directly in this presentation, but I'd be happy to talk in the Q&A speculatively about what the demise of the Awami League, of USAID, and maybe development as we know it might mean for the future as well. Okay, so by way of introduction, let me take you into the book's main space, the Bengal Delta and Bangladesh's Southwest Delta Zone. Just to orient you a little bit before I jump into the talk, these are the places that I'll be talking about in this talk. This is Munjia Gabura on the map here is a small island, which is quite close to the India-Bangladesh border. The greater Mongla region features quite prominently in here. Mongla is Bangladesh's second largest port. It's a port situated directly upstream of the Sundarbans, the world's largest remaining mangrove forest, which sits at the delta's mouth. If you're looking for reference, the distance between Gabura and Mongla is about 40 kilometers as the crow flies. So we're talking about a fairly small space, though it's much, much further as either the boat runs or the car drives. So without further ado, let me jump into this talk. I was a fisherman for most of my life, but now the jungle is closed, so I've become a businessman. My research assistant Riton and I are sitting in a tea stall perched on an embankment in Gabura, an island in Bangladesh's Southwest Delta region. The tea stall is squeezed between the road and the embankment's edge. As we chat with a man that I will call Nurul, the stall's owner, and a group of other men who have gathered there, we look out on a seemingly endless expanse of dry shrimp ponds, or kers, inside of Gabura's embankments. Stretching off into the horizon, these are small to mid-sized plots of land hemmed in by short earthen plinths that, when filled, contain the brackish water in which shrimp are grown. Behind us and outside of Gabura's embankments lies the wide Kolpetua River, a tidal river that flows down and out through the delta and into the Bay of Bengal. On the far side of the Kolpetua, shimmering green in the late afternoon heat, is the Sundarbans, the world's largest remaining mangrove forest. This is the jungle of which we speak. The men sitting with us have some time on their hands. Some work in these shrimp gers, but most are fishermen, or jele, in the Sundarbans. This month, fishing has been suspended to allow crab and fish to spawn. It's one of a host of new government initiatives and mandated conservative measures designed to help protect the mangrove forest and address the threat of anthropogenic damage to its critical ecology. Nurul, as he pours tea for his customers, is talking about this closure, but he's also speaking more broadly about a series of restrictions that have made fishing in the mangroves more tenuous. The fishermen in the group grumble about these measures. Most take them as evidence of the government's failure to care for the people who rely on the mangroves for their livelihoods. Why has the jungle been closed, I ask? Nurul shrugs. It's a matter of oxygen or bapar. Some countries have said, if the Sundarban survives, you'll get some benefits. Your fishermen, your honey collectors, don't allow them inside the jungle. The other fishermen nod their agreement, spit red juice from the pon or betel nut that they're chewing on the ground, and sip their tea. A matter of oxygen. Neural's evocative framing captures in a few words the broad scope of debates about the Sundarbans, the Bengal Delta in which it sits, and the future of Bangladesh, and indeed life in a warming world. Who will get literal and figurative air to breathe? When and how? And at what and whose expense? In the Sundarbans and the debate over its care lie a host of possible answers to these questions. The Delta has become to be imagined as a ground zero of climate change, a place where the future of global warming is happening now. Like the Delta in which it sits, the Sundarbans looms large in discussions of how to manage the future and the present. Such discussions hinge broadly on calls for care and preservation in a warming world. But who is to be cared for, what is to be preserved, how and to what ends are significantly less clear. These broad discussions about and visions of the Delta's future, in turn, yield a bounty of new projects, policies, and practices that shape everyday life for people like those drinking tea in Neural's shop, and perhaps for us all. Delta Futures asks what happens when a set of interests in conservation, development, international security, and urban growth and industrialization all anticipate different climate-affected futures in the same place, Bangladesh, and at the same time, the present. It argues that to understand the ways that that the future produces the present in the Delta, one must continue to be attentive to the problems of land, of territorial control, and of the articulation between various forms of capture, rents, global imaginations, terrain, animals, people, and more. It's a book about the assembling of the Delta as a climate frontier, a space, to borrow Anna Singh's evocative framing, of visions and vines and violence, where expropriation, extraction, and dispossession are increasingly organized around a near future of marked ecological transformation and unfold on and through the Delta's protean landscape. Situated in Bangladesh's southwest Delta zone and the Sundarbans, the book elaborates the Delta's climate frontier through three lines of inquiry. First, it asks how these radically different visions of the future are grafted onto the present. Second, it explores the ways that these competing future visions' incommensurabilities, that is to say, their inability to come into being in the same place and at the same time, pose threats for human and non-human life. And third, and most importantly, it traces the experience of life amidst these multiple Delta futures for those who live on the bleeding edge of climate change. Fishermen and peasants like those gathered in Neural's tea stall, and others imagined as tomorrow's climate migrants. So let me take you briefly into a few Delta futures that are central to the broader assembly of the climate frontier and to the Delta's present. I initially came to the Delta region for research in 2013 as part of an ongoing collaboration with Nidra Kori, Bangladesh's landless movement, and Kasha Papraki, a friend and colleague at the London School of Economics who has also written about climate change and development in this region. We came to conduct a participatory, community-based project on the social costs of brackish water shrimp aquaculture, an export-oriented production boom that had, over the last 2 decades, radically transformed what had been arable land and social space in the Delta into a series of shallow and muddy chemical-laden pools. The shrimp gears are what I showed a picture of a few slides back. It also triggered a collapse in the agrarian labor market and a massive outmigration from the region, as shrimp required comparatively small amounts of labor compared to agricultural production. At the time, it was possible not to notice the profusion of new development projects in the region. What was notable about many of these projects, all of which claimed to be related to climate change in some way, was how poorly they seemed to sit within the realities of life and ecological change in the Delta region. They seemed of a profoundly different order than development projects that I had studied in the past in Bangladesh, such as microcredit initiatives that were meant to integrate small-scale entrepreneurs into market economies and instill neoliberal sensibilities in them. Many of these projects claimed to produce resilient peasants, able to weather the unspooling chaos of climate change while remaining fixed in place. Claims to resilience, as I argue at more length in the book, often hinge not just on adaptation, but also on emplacement. How might development serve as a stopgap to prevent mass displacement from places like the Delta, being the central question. As such, they articulated with global imaginations of Bangladesh as a site from which waves of climate migrants might threaten regional and indeed global security. Yet their paradoxical ineffectiveness begged a straightforward seeming question. What were these new projects meant to do, and who did they serve? To understand this puzzle, it's instructive to explore one of the more recognizable projects in the region, a climate-smart integrated house constructed on Gabura and meant to help residents survive the chaos of climate change in place. The house was constructed by World Fish, an international research organization and one of the members of the Consultative Group on International Agricultural Research. The house was a one-off demonstration project constructed at a material cost of $6,000. It was famous in Gabura and known locally either as the Pani, or water, house, or Duitola, two-story, a reference to the fact that it was the only home on the island with 2 stories. The house sat in a village primarily inhabited by smallholder farmers and landless laborers. It housed a single family chosen through their industrious participation in NGO support groups following Cyclone Isla, which hit the region in 2009. The house itself was brimming with adaptive technologies, including a covered well for irrigation, storage tanks for drinking water, an indoor fish pond, a complex drip irrigation system in the window boxes, and much more. Yet more revealing of the vision of climate resilience embodied in the house than these technologies were its social implications. Anyone, including other residents of the village in which it was situated, could enter to marvel at the technologies of resilient development that were on display there. But none of these technologies were things that the village at large was meant to benefit from. The house was built and designed explicitly for a single family situated within, but removed from, the rest of the community. Now, development operates through a profoundly visual language. The point of pilot and model projects like this one is that they demonstrate the efficacy of interventions in a particular location that stands in for a multiplicity of other potential locations. These projects, model villages, demonstration plots, and so on, dramatize the distinction between the space of the project and the undeveloped space outside of it. On Gabura, the clustering of projects in a single space highlighted this visual distinction. In a pattern replicated in many projects throughout the region, the Pani House accumulated other projects within its perimeter. The Pani House's backyard, pictured here, for example, housed an International Union for the Conservation of Nature, or IUCN, test plot for climate-smart watermelon production. That's this raised bed in the background here. As well as a USAID irrigated rice plot. That's the green in the foreground. These fields were neatly cordoned off by a bluish fishnet fence that defined the property boundary. The fence marked a stark contrast between the Pani House and the unirrigated, dry, and dusty rice fields beyond, the agricultural fields farmed by all of the other residents of the village. The message in this contrast proved hard to miss. Inside the project boundaries, resilient development flourished. Outside and surrounding it lurked the non-resilient future. The contrast between the climate-smart house and other households in the village was dramatic, but also at once beside and indeed precisely the point. The community and the house's residents were not the primary audiences for these interventions. Indeed, as my colleague and I were told by a World Fish representative in Dhaka, the Pani House was meant more for the website than for the people. Now, over time, I came to understand such projects not as interventions in the Delta landscape, but also, and primarily, as projects that were about solving global anxieties about Bangladesh as one space among many in the global South where future climate chaos would produce millions of footloose climate refugees, spilling like a veritable tidal wave over proximate and remote borders. These projects were meant, on the one hand, to offer portable, small-scale development solutions that would allow potential climate migrants to remain fixed in place, to prevent, as one outgoing British development professional described it to me, the UK from redlining when 160 million Bangladeshis showed up on its shores. On the other, and perhaps more importantly, they were meant to produce spectacles that could be transmitted to global audiences, communicating that managing the possible displacing effects of climate change was possible, practicable, and already underway in global climate hotspots. That is to say, these projects, understood in their proper light, were experiments in climate security. tools to help ground populations in place that were also, and indeed primarily, technologies designed to satisfy climate anxieties elsewhere. Second, I was struck by the profound industrialization and development in and around Mongla, Bangladesh's second largest port after Chittagong. What was striking about this construction was that it was taking place literally on the same terrain that many international development organizations understood as a climate wasteland foretold, a space that many argued would be uninhabitable in 20 to 50 years' time. Now, when I'd first visited Mongla in 2007, it was a sleepy delta port town known primarily as the gateway to the Sundarbans mangrove forest for tourists. At the time, the port managed the loading and unloading of several hundred container ships per year. But in recent years, Mongla Port had grown by several orders of magnitude. Its port authority was now managing upwards of 10,000 mid-sized ships per year. But port expansion was not the only thing booming in Mongla. Spanning north along the Mongla-Khulna Highway was an expansive industrial corridor where previously there had been only countryside. On the west side of the road, flanking the Poshuru River, one of the largest waterways in the Delta, a wall of industrial development had sprung up. New cement factories, LPG storage facilities, and other industry filled the space between the road and the Poshuru River. Viewed from the river itself, these factories were a wall of industrialization, growing steadily northward from the port to the Delta interior. The road connecting Mongla to Khulna, the major city in the region, was in a state of profound disrepair, buckling and sinking into the Delta siltscape from the constant passage of overloaded trucks, carrying construction material and workers from Mongla to these sites. The region was caked in dust kicked up by these trucks as it labored by. This corridor stretched northward towards the then in construction, now completed Rampal Power Plant, a 1,360 megawatt coal-burning power plant being constructed just about a dozen kilometers north of the Sundarbans itself, the infrastructurally critical but ecologically fragile mangrove forests. This corridor expanded over the years I conducted this research. On the east side of the road, an export processing zone was growing, ideally positioned to take advantage of proximity to the port. There was plenty of room to grow in the EPZ, and through the period I conducted research, much of it remained open. But plans were in the works to fill this space with industry requiring unskilled and semi-skilled labor. And several officials told me these jobs were to be filled by, among others, climate migrants who were moving to Mongla from other parts of the Delta. Now, the notion that Mongla will become a hub of climate migration has become central to contemporary discussions of this city. In 2011, Mongla had a modest population of 40,000. That number has tripled at least since, and probably by now more likely quintupled, largely with people migrating from other places in the Delta. This in-migration is understood not as crisis, but as opportunity. The projected growth in employment through the port and the EPZ promises to provide opportunities to those seeking work in Mongla, and the in-migration of climate refugees will fuel growth and expansion. Such growth is seen as crucial not just for Mongla as a gateway to the region, but for the future of coastal life in an urban warming world. Mongla and mid-sized and secondary cities like it are possible answers to the challenge of climate displacement, an obverse and alternative vision to the dystopian climate security that I discussed earlier. Mongla's growth might be termed a new form of climate urbanism, urban growth predicated on satisfying a need for housing and employment of the climate displaced in the global south. Whether Mongla's success is replicable in cities without booming ports and burgeoning industrial zones is certainly an open question, but within the city, the promise of successful growth in the face of the Delta's challenges led to a palpable sense of excitement and opportunity. It was in the air. As I began to explore Mongla more, I came to understand it as a space where Schumpeterian visions of climate change as creative destruction were fueling growth of a port city that was meant to be part of an infrastructural engine that would drag Bangladesh into a future of prosperity and growth, a veritable Sonar Bangla, or Golden Bengal, a vision of economic growth that figured as the fulfillment of a long-deferred promise of regional prosperity central to the political plank of the then-in-power Awami League government. Mongla, regularly described as a coastal city, sits almost 100 kilometers north of the Bay of Bengal. To reach it, tanker ships had to travel through the Sundarban's mangrove forest's shallow and frequently silting waterways to ultimately reach the port. Despite this, Mongla was increasingly figured as a critical node in regional economic integration and indeed struggles for regional hegemony, with both China and India rushing to invest money in the port as a critical site for global shipping and transportation. What puzzled me about this shift was not the urbanization per se, but the ways that it threw the radically different visions of what climate change would bring about in the Delta into sharp relief. As I worked, I came to understand these visions as incommensurate, things that couldn't really come to be in the same place and at the same time. More importantly, I came to understand these incommensurabilities as themselves producing threats. That is to say, the pursuit of all of these multiple futures of climate change at once threatened to create situations where none of these futures might come to pass. For example, the increased reliance on the Posho River for shipping meant that the Port Authority was in a constant and existential battle with siltation to keep the channel running through the Sundarbans flowing and to keep goods fueling the Port Authority and the EPZ circulating into and out of the Delta. Indeed, siltation led to frequent shipping accidents where products such as coal and toxic lantern fuel were spilled in the midst of the Sundarbans protected zone. Yet dredging projects themselves, partly through the release of pollutants, turbidity, and the destruction of benthic habitats, posed tremendous threats to the mangroves, and especially marine life within them. But perhaps the most dramatic instance of this was the threat posed by the construction of the Rampal power plant itself. The plant and the increased air and water pollution that were projected to accompany its operation was understood by many activists locally, nationally, and indeed internationally as a final proverbial nail in the mangrove's coffin. Yet Mongla, the Port Authority, and the plant itself all relied on the ongoing existence of the Sundarbans, a vast wetland that buffered the region from the worst effects of an increasing number of cyclones produced by warming waters in the shallow Bay of Bengal. The future of economic success in the region was thus itself profoundly imperiled by its own threat to the mangroves. Third, I began working with fishermen in the mangroves to better understand how a profusion of new conservation policies was impacting livelihoods and increasing precarity for those who rely on small-scale resource extraction to feed their families. This was a pressing question. The collapse of the agrarian labor market in the Delta alongside the boom in export-oriented shrimp aquaculture, which I noted earlier, had caused massive migration within and beyond Bangladesh's borders. But it had also pushed a number of landless laborers into adjacent sectors of off-farm labor, including and especially fishing in the Sundarbans and the Delta beyond, or the Bay beyond, rather. This influx was unfolding at the same time that international pressure to conserve the Sundarbans as a heritage of humanity at large and funding to enact such conservation measures was on the rise. At the outset, I anticipated that this would be a somewhat familiar story of conservation management, the progressive, policy-based, and police-enforced project of protecting the mangroves from anthropogenic change by keeping certain anthropos out of the forest. But what surprised me was that the first thing that fishermen complained about was not these new policies, but rather that they were increasingly being kidnapped and held for ransom by dakats, pirates or forest bandits. How was it that fishermen were increasingly made victims of criminal predation at the very moment that a river of international funding was flowing into the Forest Department and other institutions to conserve the mangroves through, among other things, paramilitary policing in the name of humanity at large? To understand this puzzle, it's useful to briefly chart dakat's role in the geography of small-scale resource extraction in the Delta. Historically, dakat served as strongmen in particular locales within the Sundarbans. Fishermen would pay these groups for protection and for the right to fish in a territory, materialized in the form of renewable passes. These passes were purchased from representatives of dakats living in towns and villages surrounding the Sundarbans. Fishermen would then carry these passes with them to present as proof of payment if they were intercepted inside of the jungle. This system allowed fishermen to know exactly whose territory they fished in. As Zia Alam, a retired dakat who I came to know through repeated visits to his village, explained to me, The fishermen knew what area was controlled by what group, so they know who to give money to. They knew it even better than we did. There were permitted fishermen, and then there were also non-permitted fishermen. If a non-permitted fisherman came before us, he would definitely have to pay money. If he could show us a permit, he'd be able to survive. Otherwise... Now, Alam's explanation underscored the existence not only of territorial rule, but also of a profoundly territorial moral economy of Dakati operating in the mangroves. Until recently, Dakat's principal livelihoods involved extracting various forms of rents from within the territories that they controlled. Such territories were well defined, mapping to particular rivers, ranges, and spaces within the mangrove forest. The boundaries of such territories were occasionally contested in skirmishes with rival groups, but more or less remained fixed. Now, if Dakati in the Sundarbans was historically a territorial affair, today this dynamic had changed. The emergence of the Sundarbans as a ground zero of climate change has led to intense international pressure to manage and secure the mangroves from unlicensed intruders. The last few years have consequently seen a stepping up of policing in the Sundarbans to quell Dakati in the mangroves, carried out by both RAB, a paramilitary police force known in Bangladesh for killing those it sent to intercept in what's called crossfire, and the newly formed, well-equipped, and internationally funded SMART teams tasked with policing conservation within the mangroves. Now, it's an open question as to whether such crackdowns are successful in securing the Sundarbans, but they have succeeded in significantly reconfiguring the territorial basis of Dakat activity. Dakat groups are now smaller and control much less area than they did in the past, but their predation has become more fierce. Whereas Dakat groups used to consist of 18 to as many as 50 people, they now more commonly have 5 to 6 members. Because of the increased risk and smaller number of fishermen that each group can target, Dakats have dramatically increased their ransom demands. This places tremendous pressure on fishermen in the Sundarbans. Before, fishermen could predictably work within a single large Dakat territory, but now smaller Dakat groups can control only small territories. To the extent that these territories actually exist at all, they are uncertain, in constant flux, and often overlapping. As one fisherman explained it to me, you may run into one group on one side of the canal and negotiate your release, and then you'll run into another on the other end and have to start the whole process all over again. What I came to realize is that these new conservation regimes were layered on top of long-standing political ecologies of extraction in the mangrove forest. Decades of well-honed forms of territorial control by Dakat groups, practices that look more or less like protection rackets common the world over, had been disturbed by the intrusion of paramilitary policing within the mangroves. Thus, old moral economies of fishing eroded under pressure wrought by national concerns over law and order and international concerns over the planetary threat of climate change. In the process, the Sundarbans has emerged as a new terrain of uncertainty, threat, and exploitation. The Delta has been and remains a nexus of future possibility. It's a place simultaneously imagined as doomed, vital, threatening, threatened, and ripe with productive possibility. All of these imaginations invoke a set of futures, some of which are in the process of becoming, none of which has come to pass. If these futures are incommensurate, that is to say that they can't happen all in the same place or the same time, they also are instrumental in overriding the complexities of the Delta's present. That is to say, the Delta's present is selectively subsumed within and reconfigured by projects of bringing these futures into being. Through this process, the Delta present is made to reflect what planners and practitioners wish or fear to see. As conservationists frame the Sundarbans as a critical site for the management of climate change and the future of humankind, the mangroves emerge as a space where regulation and policing can order unruly extraction regimes. As the Delta becomes central to the vision of a Golden Bengal, a port 100 kilometers upstream of the Bay of Bengal is imagined as a future coastal shipping hub with the potential to integrate the Delta into regional and global economies. Now, that planners and practitioners construct spaces or imaginaries of them within which their programs are likely to succeed has long been an axiomatic proposition in the anthropology of development. So too here in the Delta. For example, visions of a particular kind of atomized peasant family at imminent risk of being climate refugees yields development interventions that attempt to produce resilient peasants. The social and technical configuration of what resilience means, however, often has little bearing on the lived realities of Delta life in the midst of environmental change. These visions of resilience evacuate the present of the possibility of finding temporalities and meanings that articulate with the lived experiences of peasant life. These processes are interesting in and of themselves, but what is more significant are the density and growth of such visions, all operating at different scales and temporalities and to different ends in the Delta's present. These work together to remake Delta space, to reconfigure the terrain upon which the Delta's residents make their life into a climate frontier. They shape risk, possibility, and ecology in often dramatic ways, and they attempt to harness or tame the Delta's present materialities as resources for the future. There's a tendency in much contemporary discussion of climate change to understand the climate-affected future from a unitary standpoint. While the kinds of crises and environmental catastrophes that global warming heralds are various, our analytic vision often inclines towards an understanding of a singular future of climate chaos. This allows us to weigh heterogeneous interventions designed to forestall climate change against this looming, if possibly unpredictable and unknowable future. How likely is such an intervention to promote adaptation? How much can a certain policy contribute to climate mitigation? What kinds of pathways do various strategies of planning leave open for response? Yet in places like the Delta, there is a vast and competing array of different climate temporalities and outcomes at play. While a broad and predictable set of interests adhere in the making of these temporalities, capital, national development, regional hegemony, global conservation regimes, and so on, they do so in ways that cannot be reduced to a singular logic or vision of the possible future. It's certainly possible and indeed important to assess the probable impacts and outcomes of these different future-oriented projects, but doing so on a case-by-case basis, assessing, for example, how effective conservation regimes in the Sundarbans will be in preserving the mangroves for the future of humankind, risks missing important conjunctures and disjunctures. It becomes easy to miss the ways that these programs assemble different and not just unpredictable futures, and also the ways that both the projects and the futures that they summon work against each other in the present. In approaching the Delta as a climate frontier and mapping the emergent tensions between the Delta's present, futures, and pasts, Delta Futures, at least I hope, adds to an emerging body of scholarship that poses a challenge to those who are concerned with future climate change, both in Bangladesh and beyond. It asks us to think past individual projects and concerns about climate change and instead to think about the ways that imaginations about the future, as much as ecological transformations themselves, are remaking regions at large. And also, it asks us to consider what this might look like, and indeed, how it might be thought differently, from the perspectives of those who live in these regions and are increasingly figured as climate change's present and future victims. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Jason, for that tour of the book. Where's Cooper? Oh, will you let me know when you want me to stop?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. He said 10 to 15 minutes, but I could talk a lot. So thank you for the chance to read, and thank you everybody for being here on a Monday afternoon. I started reading this book a few weeks ago when I was on a plane from Stockholm to Frankfurt, and someone was sitting next to me who decided to inflict their company on me, and he looked at the cover of this and he thought that this was about the airline. And I just started reading it. I barely opened the first page, and I said, no, it's actually not about the airline. And so I had to make up what the book was about in order to get him to stop talking. So I said it's about the impact of climate change on rivers. So this time round, hopefully I will have a more informed view of the book, having actually read it before talking about it. I'm so grateful to be able to engage with you on your work, Jason. I've been here for so long, and I've read your work, but never have had the chance to actually engage with it and hopefully engage with you on it. So I've really been looking forward to this. So thank you for the opportunity. And oddly, it's also, I read work on Bengal and Bangladesh with some curiosity. I don't know if any of you are from there or speak the language. My mother's side of the family is Bengali. I don't speak any Bengali. I can say a few phrases. I can say Mata Bhenge Debo, which is a phrase my grandmother used to repeat or yell after me when I was a kid. It means I'll break your head. But it really has been an opportunity to actually engage with that. So I approach this maybe with a greater sense of curiosity or lay curiosity than I might otherwise have. This book, in Professor Khan's intellectual trajectory, really takes up in a sense, where the 2016 book Sensitive Space left off. And in that book, Professor Khan says that a sensitive space is one which troubles ideas about the coherence, durability, and stability of place. And this was a study of enclaves in the India-Bangladesh border. And this time, he journeys with us much further south to the Bengal Delta, more specifically to the central western part of the Delta, as you saw up on the overhead. The Delta itself can be read as very much as a sensitive space, and one whose forces are creating, shaping, and reshaping what might eventually become borders and enclaves. Some of the same actors in the book, the state, peasantry, industrializers, but some very new ones, the land itself, for example, or water, for that matter. And more attention in this project to the non-human or the more than human or other than human elements of the book, and sort of a shift in attention from fragmentation, if you will, to vulnerabilities. So sort of some interesting moves if you're familiar with Professor Khan's work. The goal of the book, in his words, are to theorize the Delta as a climate frontier and to sensitize the reader to the multiplicity of futures that commingle in the Delta, as he just said. And of course, he does this by way of attention to vision, materialities, and captures, as he also said. So there are multiple visions that are discussed throughout the book. So climate catastrophes or ground zeros, climate securities or collapsed systems, climate refugees, climate migrants, climate survivors, climate opportunists, climate technologists, and climate industrialists. And all of these also mingle with vernacular and agrarian futures and visions of the Delta as a critical infrastructure in need of preservation. So these visions are orchestrated in the book through 5 chapters: captured imaginations, frontier terrain, amongst tigers, ecologies of capture, and future frontiers. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what the book was like to read, and I'm also going to talk a little bit about some reactions that I had to the book. And I think that'll take me to the end of my scheduled time. So as you may have seen, from the pictures that Professor Khan's put up, the book is almost cinematic. It's a very visual book. I did not expect that. There are at least 5 or 6 photographs in each chapter, and then because of that, things really come alive for you as a reader. So images of Pani House, which you saw up there, images of the Matir Killa or the earthen mounds, the canals, the dredge ponds, the embankments, the shrimp farms, the tigers, the Bon Bibi shrine, the Mongla port, the fountain in a dredge pond in Mongla, which Jason put up, the Sundarbans, of course, crab gears, and of course the Rampal coal plant. All of these are sort of images and almost actors in this visual drama that unfolds from chapter to chapter. And so, surprisingly, this book is that very unusual academic book. It is fast-paced. And it's restless, in a sense, almost like the Delta itself, And the actors, not just the scenes, the actors, and I don't think that was that evident in your talk, but the people come alive. You get to meet Riton, you get to meet Rafiq, Jalil, the UNO, Gopal the crab fisherman, Goni Mia, Akas and Nazma. And these are real characters. These are real people who you will meet in the book. And so that kind of what I suppose you would call an ethnographic particularity is fantastic. And I think, again, sort of adds to the fact that this book, once you start reading it, you will finish it within the day. And it's thus, I think, complex, but easy to read, dare I say. It's theoretically sophisticated, but thank goodness it doesn't scold you with theory. It frames itself as both synoptic and ethnographic, but what you get when you read the book is that it moves really quickly from ethnographic particularities and biographies to theory, but there is, thank God, no tortured explanation of assemblages or more than human, and those things are just there in the book, and you are invited along for the ride, and you're not, it's not didactic. You don't have to have things explained to you, just read it. So in terms of what resonated with me, which I suppose is what really sort of a responder should be talking about, are things that, that I saw as points of connection with my own work. And there's so many that I could have spoken with. I took the gamble of talking about two because I wagered that Jason would not talk about them in his presentation, and I was right. So thank goodness for that. But I'm going to talk about siltscapes, and I'm going to talk about tigers, and if I have time, then I will talk about how the present is conceived in the book. Siltscapes are discussed in the second chapter of the book, and Professor Cons talks about siltscape as describing fundamentally uncertain matter. It is a vivid and evocative metaphor for the movement of matter and the movement of land itself. And that really resonated with me because I've drawn, like a lot of people, I imagine, I've drawn a lot on Zygmunt Bauman's work on liquidity, and I've done that in some of the work that I've done on global commodity chains, either in China or onion supply chains in India or organic cotton supply chains in India more recently. And one of the things that we study in those projects is this idea of the bullwhip effect, the idea that consumer demand in the global north and the entire infrastructures of demand and consumption end up shaping the origin spaces of those chains, whether those are organic cotton fields or onion markets or garment warehouses in China. And what we find is that those spaces, those origin spaces, are really fluid. There's a constant movement of workers, crops, garments, clothes. And in a sense, this idea of a siltscape really gets us to think about that kind of fluidity or those kinds of end zones or frontiers. And once again, this term fundamentally uncertain matter is highly evocative and something that I know that I'm going to take with me and probably cite. Silt really describes the connections in this book between livelihoods, right? Whether those livelihoods are shrimps, crab farming, fishing, or industrialization, and those connections to water and the Sundarbans themselves. And it gets us to understand that those connections are fundamentally uncertain, right? And so in that sense, I was wondering, siltscapes really sort of sets the scene for the book. I absolutely understand why the book was framed or bookended, as it were, with imaginaries at one end and infrastructure on the other. That makes complete sense. But I was reading siltscapes and going, oh, I wish I'd read that before I'd read chapter 1, but because it really illuminates chapter 1. But you can't have two first chapters, so there you are. I'll also talk about tigers and chapter 3. The book uses Anuj Ales's framing of cosmopolitan tigers versus the Sundarban tiger to great effect. And so the tigers are treated in the book as a central imaginary on one hand, and on the other, a figure that is actually entrenched and enmeshed in land, labor, and a web of predation. And this brought up for me similar themes in my work with Adivasi groups in South India, namely with the Janakuruba in and around Bandipura, who are bearing the brunt of what Dan Brockington, 20 years ago now, called fortress conservation practices by states and elite NGOs. The book mentions a Mandal, an Adivasi, a Mandal tradition a set of rituals to ward off and make themselves immune from tigers. And that reminded me a lot of what Janukoruba and Bandipora themselves do. They do something similar, but over there, I know that it's part of a broader relation that indigenous group has to the more than human, to animals at large, whether or not it's a bird, whether or not it's a bee, or whether or not it's a tiger. I keep wanting to say more than human, but really the humans are less than animal, right? Deity is manifested in everything for Janukoruba. And so just that one quick sentence really got me to sort of think about the question of in whose interest is it to frame these human-animal encounters in the Shondarbans or Bandipura as conflicts, right? So these encounters always bring up multiple narratives, especially when they're covered by newspapers of a single predatory animal and human victim, etc. And they're often used in the service of efforts to clear buffer zones of people and enlarge this fortress, right? So a kind of capture, if you will. So the book in that chapter does a fantastic job of describing the multiplicity of dispositions to life in and around the jungle. And as Jason says, very few people saw tigers as malicious predators. Some of them were even blasé about it. And those are sort of narrations that resonated really well with me. And on page 77, I think Alam says that there is tension in the jungle. And that's another beautiful phrase that stayed with me, because how Professor Khan's describes the place of tiger and humans is not to binarize a human-animal or relationship, and not to see it, as he says, as opposite sides of an environmental binary, but forged by the same environment, right? Tigers are afflicted by the same forces as humans and are subject to the same web of violence. You know, that's what produces them as predators in the first place. And that's and the chapter also does this really witty link between bag or tiger and bagachingri, which are tiger shrimp, but I won't get into that because I'm nearly out of time. So I have a bunch of other questions for you, ranging from how did you get to the Delta region? How did you frame this as a Delta project and also as a futures project? As you say, those aren't emic terms. I'll just end by saying that, you know, the book begins by talking about, you know, the end of the Awami League regime and the fact that Hasina fled the country last summer and the protests that led to that. Everybody, when we write books, always go, I should have written this 6 months later, because then I could have talked about the impact of that. But what I think is beautiful about this book is that the themes in it, what is being said, are not restricted to what happened before or after the Awami League, I don't think. You know, the idea of visions, materialities, and captures as describing life, both present and multiple futures in the Shundarbans, is something that I think is going to stand the test of time. You know, this is something that we will read 15 years later, and it will be as resonant then as it is now. Thank you for writing it, and thank you for letting me respond.
Jason, if you'd like to give any response to Shiv, and then we'll probably have time for one, maybe two questions.
I'll give a quick response to Shiv, and then maybe we can continue the conversation. Thank you so much. Those outrageously generous commentary. I really appreciate it. Thank you for noting the writing. I mean, that was something that was really important to me. Writing this book, I wanted it to be something that was readable and could be read by people in Bangladesh, by people in undergraduate classes. I didn't want it to read like my first book, which I think is very much like a dissertation project. So I thank you for noting that. The ordering of the question around siltscapes, thank you for bringing up tigers and siltscapes. Those are two of my favorite chapters. They're just like I could have talked about them, but one has to make some choices. But yeah, I mean, the question of why the siltscape follows on the question of imaginaries, I think what was really important to the framing of the book is so much of the way I came to sort of reckon with some of the puzzles that I'm dealing with in the book was through that early work of thinking about like how do I understand these projects, which on the one hand look just like every other development project ever in their kind of ambitions and the failure of those ambitions, but at the same time really feel like they're doing something profoundly different, right? Which is that in contrast to something like microcredit, which promises a better future, all that these projects seem to offer was the possibility of survival. They were profoundly dystopian in frame, as opposed to utopian, which is sort of, I think, central to the constitution of development. So that's what I felt like I really wanted to start there, and then I felt like the materiality would take me into the subsequent discussions of pirates and tigers and those kind of things. It's an interesting question. I think that you answered the question of who do those narratives do work for, the narratives of framing the relationship between humans and tigers as conflicts. I mean, I think it's very much part of a broader narrative that facilitates a certain kind of intervention in the region, both at a conservation and at a development scale. There's a video by a USAID video that I discussed that does this quite explicitly, that essentially says, well, you know, the people of the American people are saving tigers in Bangladesh by teaching peasants how to do agriculture, because they didn't know how to do that before. And I mean, it's exactly this kind of thing, right? Like we save we save the tigers from this human-tiger conflict by enacting sets of projects that fulfill other kinds of goals that are already in place for USAID. So that I think that narrative serves these kind of broader imaginaries, much like the development projects that I discussed at the outset of the presentation. Maybe I'll hold off on answering the how did I get to the Delta and how it became a Delta project. That's a really interesting question. But just so to get some other, give some other folks a chance.
I think we've lost all the people who needed to leave for class, so we're with family now. Any person with the questions? We'll take a couple and then let Jason batch them together.
Hi, thanks so much for speaking with us. My first question might touch on what you were saving, but I wanted to know more about your writing process and like how you engage in translating really academic subjects into stories of real people and real settings that's accessible.
Thank you.
Any other questions, or we'll start with that? Oh.
Thank you. I just had a small question on whether there were any Indian and Bangladeshi cooperative mechanisms that were working in at the regional level in the Delta.
Thanks. Those are great. Two really different questions, but both really excellent ones. Maybe I'll start with the second one and then come back to my writing process. There's so many different cooperative programs that are unfolding in the Delta. Indeed, the Rampal Power Plant is a cooperative project, right? It's being built. It was built, designed, and is run by an Indian management company. It's actually the official name of the Rampal Power Plant is the India-Bangladesh Friendship Power Plant. So there's that. I mean, there are also, the Sundarbans at large is an interesting joint management problem because the protected area of the mangroves falls on either side of the border. The bulk of it is in Bangladesh, but about a third of the Sundarbans is in India. I'm not sure how, if I was to describe it descriptively, I wouldn't say that it's necessarily a cooperative project. There's a huge amount of competition. There's constantly claims that one side has more tigers than the other, and rumors about whether that's because of design or nefarious practice. But there's many sort of points where that kind of conversation unfolds. What's really interesting is where the disjunctures are, I think, more than where the similarities are. I mean, the way that India conceives the region is so profoundly different than the way Bangladesh does, right? Like in India, the region which is called the Sundarbans region is occupied. And there are protected areas of the forest, but people live in the Sundarbans. In Bangladesh, basically, the islands in the Delta are clear-cut right up to the Sundarbans. Right across the river from the mangroves are islands full of shrimp ponds and nothing else, right? Almost no mangroves left. So if you look at the management plans, the way they differ often are if India has kind of a managed retreat proposition for moving people out of the Sundarbans region. It's not one that I think anyone is taking very seriously, but just sort of the idea that you could imagine a concept where you would move millions of people out of this region and settle them in other places in the country is not one that would be entertainable in any way in Bangladesh, right? There's just not space. And so that's part of what drives a lot of the anxiety on the Bangladesh side, or about the Bangladesh side, right? There's 20 million people live in this Delta region, and there's nowhere for them to go that's not across a border. So yeah, it's a mixed bag, and I can talk at more length, but there are many cooperative projects, but there's also like kind of these fissures. In terms of the writing process, yeah, thanks for asking that. I mean, I'm struggling to say something pithier than like a lot of revision, and some kind friends who were like willing to tell me that what I had written wasn't succeeding at what it was doing. But like beyond that sort of basic practice, I think that there's a well-timed, indeed well overdue move in anthropology, and especially amongst at least some ethnographers, of trying to move away from the kind of turgid prose which really characterized the discipline for a very long time, and foreground the stories of people and let ethnography do more of the work, right? Which is what it was always supposed to be in the first place. The whole idea of an ethnographic project was that people would have space to tell their stories and the writer would have space to honor those stories. And that's so often, because of disciplinary norms and pressures, ended up not being the case. That like the stories that had the most people in them were also the most inaccessible and incomprehensible. And I think that it's not as though that's completely gone away, but I feel like there's a growing commitment to sort of saying, like, there's a discourse, like there are places within texts which are designed for people to have conversations with their friends and their enemies, and those are called footnotes. And that's, I think there's still some work to be done, but I really worked to think, like, if I am trying to make a theoretical point, and I don't think that the book is like necessarily free of theory, I've just tried to not sort of lead with the theory. If I wanted to demonstrate that empirically, like what's the minimum that I can sort of say about that, and then let the stories speak for themselves. And honestly, it's not how I was trained. I don't think it's how most of us were trained. So it's actually not that natural. You'd think it would be, but it's hard, right? It's really hard work. But yeah, I mean, that combined with a lot of drafts is really the answer to that. But thank you for the question.
Very wonderful. I think we are going to wrap up here. We have the room reserved for a few more minutes, so if you'd like to hang around. But just let me have us all one last time give a great thanks to Professor Collins and Professor Ganesh.
Thank you, everyone. That was really lovely. It was a pleasure to be here.